The lid of the velvet box snapped shut just as I stepped into Riviera Jewelers, and that soft little click traveled straight through my ribs like a cold current. I didn't see his face yet, only the reflection of a platinum band floating in the glass. The air smelled like polish and perfume, the kind that clings to the back of your throat, while a saleswoman murmured timeless as if the word itself were a blessing. I stood there, with a birthday bracelet list in my hand, willing my heart to slow down, telling myself that any ring in any box could belong to anyone. A laugh drifted from the far case low, please too familiar for strangers, and I felt the floor tilt just enough to make me grip my purse. I wasn't ready to know not yet, so I turned my eyes to my shoes and pretended I'd come in for watch batteries because some truths are easier to absorb in smaller sips. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever felt that hush in your chest when something you love starts to shift, tap like and subscribe, so more women can find stories where truth, justice, and dignity finally breathe again. I've always been the steady one, the list maker, the kind of woman who knows every teacher's name at the school and which neighbor keeps spare AAA batteries. At 38, my job at the community college feels like a second home, a place where paperwork and possibility hold hands. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago, daughter of a hairdresser who kept a shoebox of savings under the bed and a calendar of overtime stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a rooster. When Mom died 2 years after I married, she left a neat envelope with my name on it, bonds, a few small pieces of jewelry wrapped in tissue, and enough cash to make a down payment if I was careful. I wore her gold locket to the closing on our modest Lincoln Park home, and when the realtor handed us the keys, Mark kissed my forehead and said, "We're building a life, Claire." I believed him because believing is easier when your hands are full of keys and your chest is full of hope. Mark moved through the world with that well-pressed confidence people mistake for certainty. At 40, he carried a badge of long hours and the faded bravado of someone whose phone never stopped buzzing. When Sophie came along, we agreed I'd scale back so I could be the one at pickup, the one who remembered extra mittens and picture day money while his career carried us forward. On weekends, we did ordinary things. Target runs pancakes on mismatched plates, folding little shirts that smelled of soap and sunshine. Small rituals that make a marriage look settled from the curb. At church, potlucks, and block parties, he was effortless and easy, the neighbor who fixed a wobbly fence post and never forgot names. I was the quieter half, happy to linger near the deviled eggs and talk about first-grade reading lists. We weren't fancy, but the lights stayed on, the mortgage got paid, and the yard was just big enough for Sophie's chalk rainbows. If I'm honest, the first shiver in the glass came long before the jewelry store, back when Mark started taking calls in the hallway and saying he'd be right back, only the right back became an hour. He stopped, setting his phone on the table face up. It began living in his pocket, buzzing against his hip like a second heartbeat. I told myself logistics meant odd hours and that a grown man could keep a few things to himself without the sky falling. Privacy isn't the same as secrecy, I said, and I tried not to notice how he shaved on Saturday evenings before he said he had to check on a truck. Paige didn't buy it. During a rare sister's breakfast, black coffee and pancakes with whipped cream, we sat in a booth by the window while she worried the corner of a napkin and said, "Claire, something's off." I smiled, added more syrup, and insisted we were fine. There's a way a house swallows sound when something's wrong, a soft hollowing in the spaces where conversation should live. I started hearing that silence after Sophie fell asleep. I'd load the dishwasher and listen to Mark talk about supply chains while he scrolled, watch his thumb fly across the glass, see the ghost of a smile that didn't reach me. Our calendar squares filled with practical things, pediatrician, oil change, book fair. But the little notes I used to tuck on the fridge fell away. On our 10th anniversary, I set the table and waited until the candles bent into soft commas. He came home late and pressed a kiss to my hair, saying a client dinner had run long. And I told myself not to make a meal out of a single night. People get tired. People forget. People change, but not like this. I whispered to the sink as the water ran too hot. The morning the hinge turned began in the gentlest way, Sophie swinging her legs at breakfast cereal milk clinging to her lip, telling me Daddy took her for ice cream after school, and a lady with sparkly earrings thought it was funny when Sophie asked for extra sprinkles. I swallowed my questions because 6-year-olds repeat as much as they invent, and because I was still the kind of woman who wanted to be sure before she believed the worst. Later that night, when Mark fell asleep on the couch, his phone lit up with a subject line neat as a receipt. "Thank you for your purchase." I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, then opened a new tab and looked up Riviera's hours like I was searching for a weather report. And the next afternoon, with a list for a simple bracelet and a heart beating like a trapped bird, I walked toward the door with the little bell that would tell me whether I was about to step into a storm or a story I could still correct. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped into the jewelry store, and every instinct in me screamed to turn around before anyone noticed. But it was too late. My eyes landed on him instantly, because you don't miss the person you've built a life with, not when they're standing 3 feet from a diamond ring. Mark was leaning against the counter, speaking in a voice I hadn't heard in years, warm, eager, almost boyish. And beside him, her hand rested on his arm like she owned it. Her hair was sleek, her nails polished to a hard shine, and when the clerk set the velvet box in front of them, she leaned in with the smile of a woman who believed she'd already won. My stomach lurched because I recognized the box before he even opened it. I had seen the receipt. I had read the subject line that thanked him for the purchase. Still, a stubborn piece of me had clung to the idea that I was wrong, that the ring might be for me. That piece of me shattered in that second. I must have made some small sound, because Mark turned. His eyes went wide, the color draining from his face, and his lips parted like he was a schoolboy caught in a lie. The air in the store tightened. People glanced up from their browsing, waiting to see what would unfold. He stammered Claire, but I didn't let him continue. My voice carried across the glass, steady in a way I didn't know I could summon. "So, this is where my mother's money went. On a ring for your mistress." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. The clerk froze. The woman beside him didn't flinch, though. She folded her arms and leaned closer into him like my words had been nothing more than background noise. When she finally spoke, her tone was cool and dismissive. "Maybe if you kept him happy, he wouldn't need me." Her arrogance landed like a slap before my own hand ever did. I don't even remember moving. I only remember the crack of my palm against her cheek, the sharp intake of breath from every stranger watching, and the way she stumbled back, clutching her face in shock. Mark's hand clamped around my arm, his voice lowered but desperate. "Let's talk outside. Please." I yanked myself free, glaring at both of them. "Talk? You had every chance. Instead, you paraded her around like I don't exist." My throat burned, but I wouldn't cry here, not in front of her, not in front of him. I straightened my shoulders, turned, and walked out. The cold Chicago air rushed against my face like water over fire. Behind me, Mark called my name, but I didn't look back. I didn't go straight home. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour past the same stoplights and coffee shops I'd passed 1,000 times before. The city felt strange, like I'd stepped outside of my own life. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Sophie was already home from school, sitting at the kitchen table with her crayons. I forced a smile and kissed the top of her head, but inside, I was hollowed out. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hand on his arm, her voice taunting me. I slipped out of bed and stood in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the envelope of papers I still kept in a drawer, the records from my mother's estate. I thought of her long hours at the salon, her tired hands pressing tips into a jar marked for Claire. That money had been her sacrifice, her way of giving me a foundation, and now it had been spent on a woman who smirked in my face. The next morning, I poured coffee while Sophie chatted about her spelling test. She mentioned casually that Daddy had taken her for ice cream a few days earlier. "But he said not to tell you," she added with a giggle, swinging her legs under the chair. My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. "What lady?" I asked carefully. Sophie shrugged. "She had pretty earrings." Daddy held her hand when he thought I wasn't looking. She said it so innocently, like she was describing a cartoon. My chest tightened until I thought I might faint, but I kept my voice steady for her sake. Later, when I called Paige, she didn't sound surprised. "Claire, I told you something wasn't right," she said quietly. I didn't argue with her this time. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the floor while she talked about betrayal and choices. I heard her, but I also heard my own pulse pounding in my ears, telling me this wasn't just about Mark anymore. This was about Sophie, about my mother's memory, about the years I had given up believing in us. That weekend, Mark tried to act like nothing had happened. He walked into the kitchen with his usual smirk, asking about dinner plans, about whether I'd remembered to pick up dry cleaning. I stared at him across the counter, wondering how many times he had practiced this performance, how long he thought he could keep two lives going without them colliding. His phone buzzed on the counter, and his hand shot out faster than I'd ever seen, shoving it into his pocket before Sophie noticed. That one reflex told me everything. I spent Sunday in a haze of quiet observation, watching him scroll through his phone in the living room while Sophie played on the rug. His thumb moved quickly, and I noticed the faint curve of a smile tugging at his lips. I wanted to grab the phone and throw it against the wall, but I didn't. Instead, I filed the image away with the receipt, with Sophie's words, with the memory of the jewelry store. Each piece fit together into a picture I could no longer ignore. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth while Mark lingered in the doorway. He leaned against the frame arms crossed, acting casual. "Rough week?" he asked, like nothing had happened, like my silence wasn't screaming through the house. I met his eyes in the mirror, toothpaste still foaming on my lips. "You think I don't know?" I said softly. His smile faltered, but he didn't answer. He just shrugged and walked away. Lying in bed afterward, I stared at the ceiling until dawn crept in around the curtains. I realized I had reached the edge of something. For years, I had carried the weight of keeping our family together, believing his promises, making excuses. But now, the excuses had run out. The cracks weren't hairline anymore. They were wide and jagged, tearing through everything we had built. And for the first time, I admitted to myself that they couldn't be patched over. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew I couldn't stay still. The humiliation in that jewelry store, the sight of Sophie's wide eyes as she spoke of the lady with earrings, the way my mother's sacrifice had been stolen, those things had carved something new inside me. Something sharp. Something certain. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought repeated itself with steady rhythm. This was only the beginning. The nights became the hardest part. Once Sophie was asleep, the house turned too still. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the hallway clock, reminding me of what wasn't being said. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mark's steady breathing beside me. Sometimes I wondered if he slept easily because guilt never touched him, or if he had convinced himself his lies were justified. I stayed quiet, but inside my chest ached with questions that had no safe place to land. I found myself moving carefully as though noise might break the thin surface I was balancing on. At dinner, I asked Sophie about school, nodding along to her excited stories while pushing food around my plate. Mark chimed in with casual remarks as though the tension between us didn't exist. I answered with clipped phrases, neither warm nor cold, just enough to keep the evening from unraveling. He didn't press, and I resented him for that silence, for letting me carry the weight alone. Some nights, I cried softly in the bathroom with the water running, the sound of the faucet covering my sobs. I pressed a towel to my face, not wanting Sophie to wake to the sound of her mother breaking. The tears weren't only for the betrayal. They were for the years I had bent myself into something smaller, quieter, more patient, always hoping that if I cared enough, Mark would notice and meet me halfway. Paige came over one afternoon after a long shift at the hospital. She took one look at me and shook her head, setting down a bag of takeout. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. I shrugged, trying to smile. She didn't push, just unpacked cartons of food and filled my plate. While Sophie chattered about her drawings, Paige reached for my hand under the table. Her touch was steady, grounding, and though she didn't say a word, I felt the unspoken truth between us. She knew I was hurting more than I admitted. When Mark forgot our anniversary the year before, I had told myself it was one bad night. I had set the table with candles and made his favorite meal only to blow out the flames alone, clearing plates untouched. He came home hours later, smelling of liquor, and whispered something about a client dinner. I had swallowed my disappointment, convinced myself that broken homes break children, and stayed quiet. That memory returned often now, a reminder that the signs had always been there, waiting for me to open my eyes. I began noticing the small ways Mark kept himself at a distance. His phone never left his pocket, even when he changed into sweats after work. When Sophie showed him her newest picture, a lopsided house with 3 stick figures, he smiled, but didn't really look. I sat across the room, my throat tightening as Sophie's little face fell. She didn't say anything, but I saw it. She saw it too. The absence was no longer hidden. One evening after Sophie had gone to bed, I asked him directly, "Are you happy here?" He froze for a moment, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" His words were smooth, but his gaze slid away. I held his answer in my chest, knowing it was practiced. I didn't push further. I simply nodded, turned off the lamp, and walked upstairs alone. My silence was a shield, though inside, I was breaking piece by piece. At work, I hid behind tasks and routines, answering emails with forced cheer and greeting students with the same calm tone as always. My co-workers didn't notice anything different, and in some ways, I was grateful. It gave me a space where I wasn't the betrayed wife, just Claire, the admissions coordinator who kept things running. Yet when I returned home, the heaviness followed me through the door, settling in the corners of each room. I began keeping a journal late at night. Nothing poetic, just lists of what I saw. What Sophie said, what I felt, but couldn't say aloud. On one page, I wrote about the jewelry store. On another, I wrote about Sophie mentioning the woman with earrings. Flipping through the pages, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was all there in my own handwriting, a record of my slow unraveling. The hardest moment came one Saturday morning when Sophie climbed into bed with me, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Mommy," she whispered, "why are you sad all the time?" Her question pierced deeper than anything Mark had ever said or done. I gathered her into my arms and held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. I told her I wasn't sad, just tired, but the words tasted false on my tongue. Mark left later that day for another meeting. I watched him button his shirt in the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. He caught my gaze, offered a thin smile, and kissed Sophie on the forehead before walking out. The door closed behind him, and I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. I stared at the steamless cup and realized that the man I had once trusted with everything had become a stranger living under my roof. The silence pressed harder after that. Nights stretched longer, my thoughts circling the same questions until dawn. How much of our life together had been real? How long had he been stepping outside of it? And most of all, how much longer could I keep pretending? When Paige called again, I told her the truth in halting pieces. She listened quietly, then said, "You don't deserve this, Claire. You deserve honesty." I sat there, gripping the phone, tears sliding down my face, finally admitting aloud what I had been holding back. I wasn't just sad. I was furious, humiliated, and tired of waiting for someone else to choose me. The realization settled slowly like rain soaking into dry ground. I couldn't keep hiding behind silence forever. I couldn't let Sophie grow up believing that lies and neglect were acceptable. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. As I closed my journal that night, I pressed my hand against the cover and whispered a promise to myself. I didn't know exactly how I would keep it, but the words steadied me. This pain would not be wasted. And with that, I felt the first fragile stirrings of strength, returning a reminder that the silence couldn't last forever. Something was coming, and this time I wouldn't look away. The morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and pale, but it brought no comfort. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at the stack of envelopes from the drawer where I kept my mother's estate papers. For weeks, I had been circling around the truth, finding ways to soften it, but every detail now screamed louder than my excuses. The receipt. Sophie's innocent words, the scene in the jewelry store together, they painted a picture I couldn't pretend away. The man I had trusted most had stolen not just my faith, but my mother's sacrifice. I thought of Mom often in those days. Her hands were always tired from standing long hours at the salon, yet she never complained. She had pinched pennies and put aside what she could so her daughters wouldn't carry the same weight she did. That inheritance wasn't much, but to me, it was sacred. Mark knew what it meant, and still, he had spent it on another woman. That betrayal carried a different sting, one that cut through grief and hardened into something sharper. I moved through the house in silence, cleaning rooms, folding laundry, cooking dinner, all while carrying the knowledge that my marriage had shifted beyond repair. The effort I once put into smoothing the edges, into keeping things calm, now felt wasted. I was no longer hiding tears in the bathroom or whispering excuses to myself in the dark. I was watching Mark, clearly seeing him for who he had become, and realizing that his choices had nothing to do with my worth. One evening, Paige stopped by after her shift. She sat on the couch while Sophie built towers of blocks on the floor, and she studied me quietly. "You're different," she finally said. I asked her what she meant. "It's like you've stopped waiting for him to change. You're standing taller." Her words startled me, but she was right. Something in me had shifted. The ache was still there, but beneath it was a new steadiness. That night, after Sophie was tucked in, I opened Mark's laptop while he showered. His passwords weren't complicated. Within minutes, I found confirmation I hadn't even been searching for emails with Brianna reservations at restaurants he had never taken me to, hotel confirmations aligned with the weekends he claimed to be traveling for work. My hands shook, but my mind was strangely calm. It was no longer about proof. It was about deciding what to do with it. I printed every receipt, and saved every screenshot, sliding them into a fresh folder I labeled simply evidence. I set it in the bottom drawer of the desk where it sat heavy with both shame and clarity. It wasn't about catching him anymore. It was about protecting Sophie and protecting myself. The next morning, I called a name Paige had given me weeks earlier, Rachel Stein, a family lawyer with a reputation for being both sharp and unshakable. I sat in my car outside the college before my shift and dialed her office, my voice trembling at first. The receptionist scheduled me for the following afternoon. Hanging up, I realized my chest felt lighter than it had in months. The decision was no longer floating in front of me. I had taken the first step. That evening, Mark noticed the difference. He leaned against the counter while I made dinner, watching me closely. "You're quiet lately," he said. I didn't answer right away, just stirred the pot on the stove. Finally, I looked at him. "I'm done pretending, Mark." His brow furrowed, but before he could ask what I meant, Sophie ran into the kitchen with her crayons, and the moment passed. Still, the words hung in the air between us. He had heard them. When I walked into Rachel Stein's office the next afternoon, I carried the folder of evidence against my chest, like armor. Rachel greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that didn't flinch. I sat across from her and laid everything out: the inheritance, the ring, the Mistress Sophie's words. She listened without interruption, taking notes, then said in a measured tone, "We can build a strong case. Start collecting every document, every charge, anything that ties his spending to her. We'll make sure he doesn't walk away clean." Leaving her office, I felt the ground under me differently. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was strategy. For the first time since the jewelry store, I felt a sense of control returning, quiet but undeniable. At home, I began to shift. I stopped asking where Mark was going or when he'd be back. I stopped waiting up for him at night. Instead, I poured my energy into Sophie, into work, and into preparing for what was coming. Mark noticed, of course. One night, he asked if I wanted to join him for dinner with a colleague. I looked him in the eye and said no, then returned to my book. His smirk faltered just slightly, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty. The silence between us grew, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one belonged to me. It was deliberate, a boundary instead of a wound. I no longer felt like I was shrinking. I was gathering. One Saturday afternoon, while Sophie played in the yard, I gathered Mark's suits, ties, and shoes into bags and set them by the door. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. When he returned and saw them, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply carried them upstairs, pretending not to understand. But I knew he did. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she asked softly, "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Yes, we are." For the first time, I truly believed it. By then, the weight of denial was gone. The betrayal no longer left me paralyzed. It had given me direction. I wasn't the same woman who cried into a towel at midnight. I was awake, and I was ready to act. The cracks had widened into something I could no longer patch, but in those broken lines, I saw a path forward. A path where Mark would face the truth he had buried, and where Sophie and I would reclaim our peace. And as I closed the curtains that night, I felt it in my bones. This was no longer survival. This was the beginning of a reckoning. I woke the next morning with my mind sharper than it had been in months. The exhaustion was still there, but it felt different, like the ache you get after carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. The humiliation still burned in my chest, but now it carried with it a sense of direction. I wasn't going to collapse. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to dismantle the life Mark had built on my back piece by piece. until all he had left was the weight of his own choices. The first thing I did was secure what I could. After dropping Sophie at school, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop logged into our joint accounts and began moving every cent that I legally could into an account under my name alone. It wasn't much compared to what had been siphoned away, but it was mine and it was safe. Then I called the bank, flagged the suspicious charges, and froze the joint credit card. If Mark wanted to play house with Brianna, he could do it without my mother's money. By 10 o'clock, I was on the phone with Rachel. Her tone was brisk but steady. Document everything she told me: receipts, statements, screenshots, anything that connects his spending to her. The more we have, the stronger our case. Her instructions grounded me. For once, I wasn't just reacting. I was building. I printed every statement and clipped them neatly into a folder that was growing heavier by the day. Across the front, in thick black marker, I wrote one word: evidence. That afternoon, while Sophie colored in the living room, I went through Mark's closet. Every pressed shirt, every polished shoe, every tie he wore to charm his way through dinners that were never really about work. All of it went into black garbage bags. I stacked them by the front door. Each one a reminder that his presence in this house was no longer a given. My hands trembled as I worked, but it wasn't from grief. It was adrenaline steadying me with each bag I tied shut. I called a locksmith and scheduled the locks to be changed later in the week. Then I phoned my boss. I need more hours, I said firmly, permanently. He hesitated, reminding me that I had always preferred part-time to balance home life. I cut in before he could finish. My family situation has changed. I need the work. He agreed. Just like that, another piece of my independence was set firmly in place. By evening, the house looked different. His belongings were piled by the door. The folder of evidence sat thick on the table. A new savings account for Sophie had been opened, and I had already deposited the first transfer. The air felt clearer without his clothes hanging in the closet or his papers scattered across the desk. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine. That's when the front door opened. Mark stepped inside, phone in hand, the usual smirk on his face. He stopped short when he saw the bags by the door. His eyes darted to me standing in the kitchen with my arms crossed. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Your things," I said calmly. "Packaged and ready. You don't live here anymore." His jaw tightened. "Claire, don't do this. We can fix it." That scene at the store was... "Don't insult me!" I cut in, my voice sharp and steady. "You lied. You stole. You humiliated me in front of strangers, and you did it with money that wasn't yours. You don't get to stay." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, as though intimidation might still work. "You think you can just throw me out? This is my house too." I pointed to the folder on the table. "Not for long. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I've already frozen the accounts. By tomorrow, your cards won't work, and every charge tied to her is documented. You won't win this." The color drained from his face. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. He tried again, softer this time. "Claire, please. Don't do this to Sophie." I steadied my voice. "You did this to Sophie, the moment you brought her into your lies. I'm making sure she doesn't grow up thinking this is what love looks like." His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at the bags, at the folder, then back at me. I picked up my keys, opened the front door, and stood aside. "You have until tomorrow to pick them up. After that, the locks change." I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, but it felt like freedom. Behind me, the silence of the house carried more weight than his words ever had. For once, I wasn't the one left speechless. The fallout came quickly. The next morning, His credit card was declined at a gas station. I knew because he called me from an unknown number, his voice sharp with panic. "What the hell did you do?" he barked. "I secured what was mine," I replied calmly. "You'll have to figure out the rest. You can't just cut me off." I already did. I hung up before he could say more. By noon, Paige texted me a screenshot from social media. Someone had posted about the scene at Riviera Jewelers. Guy buying a diamond ring for his mistress gets caught by his wife in front of everyone. Wife slapped the girlfriend. Whole store froze. Best Tuesday of my life. It had already racked up hundreds of comments. I didn't have to tell my story. The city was already telling it for me. Eric's No Marks coworkers weren't blind either. One of them, a man I had met once at a company barbecue, sent me a private message. I always thought he was shady. Don't let him spin this. People at the office are already talking. Meanwhile, Brianna's polished facade was beginning to crack. Later that day, I saw her Instagram posts shift from polished photos to defensive captions about haters and jealous people. She didn't mention Mark directly, but the comments under her posts told the story clearly. "Girl, this the guy from Riviera Jewelers? Imagine thinking you're winning when you're just the side piece." That evening, Sophie and I ate pasta and garlic bread at the kitchen table. The peace felt new, almost fragile. She chattered about her day while I listened, savoring the quiet that came with his absence. Halfway through dinner, the doorbell rang. My fork froze midair. Through the window, I saw him standing on the porch, hair disheveled, tie loosened, his face pale. He rang again, more insistent this time. "Stay here," I whispered to Sophie. I walked to the door but didn't open it. "Go away, Mark. Claire." "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Just talk to me. Let me explain." I laughed bitterly. "Explain what?" "That you spent my mother's money on another woman, that you dragged our daughter into it. What's left to explain?" His hand thudded against the door. "You're making a mistake. You can't just cut me out of my own house. This isn't your house anymore," I snapped. "And you're not welcome here. If you want to see Sophie, you'll do it through court. Until then, stay away." There was silence, then his voice dropped to a whisper. "She's gone, Claire. Brianna left when she realized the money's locked up. Please, I just need to come home." The word home twisted inside me. He thought he could return just because she had left him, as if my forgiveness was a spare room waiting to be filled. "You lost this home the second you betrayed me," I said coldly. "Now leave before I call the police." His footsteps retreated slowly, and I waited until I heard his car pull away before going back to the table. Sophie looked up at me with wide eyes. "Was that Daddy?" "Yes," I said, forcing a small smile. "But he won't be staying here anymore." She nodded quietly and returned to her pasta. In that silence, I felt the weight of my choices settle fully on my shoulders. The first blows had landed. Mark had tasted the consequences, and I wasn't about to let him recover. Eric's mother's birthday dinner was the kind of gathering no one in his family skipped. A private dining room in a downtown steakhouse, linen-draped tables, wine glasses polished to a shine, and relatives who dressed as though appearances alone proved loyalty. I hadn't planned on attending at first, but as the evening drew near, I realized it was the perfect stage. The people who still thought of Mark as a devoted husband, the son who carried the family name, the man who could do no wrong, they were all going to hear the truth in one sitting. When I walked in with Sophie's small hand in mine, the hum of conversation softened. Heads turned, scanning the room for Mark, who was already seated at the far end. He froze when he saw me, his fork suspended in midair. The chair beside him was empty, and I knew Brianna wouldn't be making an appearance tonight. His mother's face lit with practiced cheer. "Claire, you came?" "I wasn't sure," Her voice trailed off when she noticed the stiffness in my smile. Of course, I said, evenly. Family comes first. Dinner was a strained affair. Conversations rose and fell, punctuated by glances cast down the table toward us. Mark tried to keep his composure, but I could see the tightness in his jaw the way he avoided my gaze. When the cake was served, and his father raised a glass speaking warmly about family values and loyalty, I nearly laughed at the irony. As the applause quieted, I stood. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I'd like to say a few words, too, I began. Every eye turned to me. Mark's face drained of color. For the past 11 years, you've welcomed me as part of this family. You've celebrated milestones, birthdays, anniversaries. You believed, as I once did, that Mark and I were building something lasting. I paused, letting my gaze travel across the table. But tonight, I can't sit here and pretend anymore. Murmurs stirred. Mark shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "Claire, sit down." I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table. This is a collection of receipts, bank statements, and messages, all showing how Mark has been spending not just his salary, but the inheritance my mother left me. He used it to wine and dine another woman. Just last week, I caught him buying her a diamond engagement ring. Gasps rose around the room. Susan's hand flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. Leonard's fist slammed the table hard enough to rattle silverware. Mark stood abruptly. This isn't the time or place, he snapped. It's exactly the time and place, I answered coldly. Because for years, you've let everyone think you're the perfect husband, the loyal son. But here's the truth laid bare. I slid a receipt down the table toward Leonard. Dinner for two. Not with me, not with Sophie. With her. Another paper followed. Hotel charges on weekends he claimed were for business trips. Finally, I pulled out the jewelry store receipt, the one with the stamped seal. And here the crown jewel. A ring bought with money my mother sacrificed to save. The room fell into suffocating silence. Susan whispered, "Mark, tell me this isn't true." He opened his mouth, but no words came. Leonard's face flushed red. "Get out!" he barked. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time." I gathered the papers back into the folder, slid it into my bag, and stood tall. When a man uses his wife's inheritance to fund another woman's lifestyle, he doesn't just lose his marriage. He loses his dignity. And you'll never get either back. I took Sophie's hand and walked toward the door, the weight of judgment pressing not on me, but on him. Behind us, I heard someone mutter, "She deserves better." And for the first time in months, I believed it. Within 48 hours, the confrontation had spread beyond the dining room. Someone's cousin had posted about it on Facebook, then screenshots appeared on Instagram, Twitter, even community forums. Mark's name wasn't trending citywide, but it was making the rounds in Chicago gossip threads. He tried to fight back. One night, Paige called me, barely containing laughter. "Turn on Channel 7, she said. I switched on the television and nearly dropped the remote. There he was, stiff in a suit, sitting across from a local news anchor. The caption under his name read, "Business professional speaks out amid marital turmoil." He sighed dramatically, his voice dripping with rehearsed pain. "My wife is a good woman, but she's been struggling. She twisted a couple of innocent dinners into an affair. I love my family. I'd never betray them," the anchor pressed. "And the jewelry store?" He chuckled lightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A misunderstanding. I was buying her a gift. My wife misinterpreted, and it got blown out of proportion." I clenched the remote until my knuckles whitened. He was painting me as paranoid, unstable, twisting everything to salvage his image, but he had underestimated me. The very next morning, I uploaded my folder of evidence screenshots, receipts, bank statements to a private drive. I sent the link to Daniel Ortiz, a blogger known for exposing local scandals. By lunchtime, the headline was Live Chicago Husband Caught Funding Mistress with Wife's Inheritance. Receipts don't lie. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Screenshots of his texts, "Can't wait to spend the weekend with you. Don't worry, she won't know," circulated on Twitter. The hotel charges aligned perfectly with dates he claimed were business trips. The ring receipt stamped and signed became the jewel of the narrative. Hashtags popped up, #receipts, don't lie, and #inheritance ring. The comments were brutal. Imagine going on TV to lie when the proof is right here. Not just a cheater, but a broke cheater, spending his wife's dead mom's money. By evening, the very stations that had given him sympathy were forced to backpedal. Channel 7's anchor opened the segment with "Yesterday, Mark Whitman claimed his wife fabricated an affair. Today, receipts tell a different story." His LinkedIn page turned into a battlefield. Endorsements disappeared. Colleagues quietly distanced themselves, and a competitor left a pointed comment. "Trust is everything in business. Hard to sell integrity when you can't live it." Brianna tried to defend herself with a long Instagram caption about love being complicated. But within minutes, commenters flooded her post with screenshots of the receipts. Someone zoomed in on an older photo pointing out the same ring glinting on her hand under restaurant lighting. She deleted her account by morning. Mark grew desperate. A few nights later, he went live on Facebook from his dimly lit apartment. His hair was unkempt, his eyes restless. "You don't know the full story," he ranted. "She's turning everyone against me. She's using my daughter as a pawn. I'm not the villain here." The comments scrolled faster than he could read. "Stop embarrassing yourself. The receipts are everywhere. You did this to yourself." Screen recordings circulated within the hour. Someone clipped the moment he shouted, "I'm not a villain," and set it to dramatic music. By morning, it had gone viral as a meme. The spiral only deepened. HR called him in at work, suspending him pending review after clients started raising questions. The golden son, the successful provider, the man who once strode into rooms with unshakable confidence, he was unraveling in full view of everyone. That night, I tucked Sophie into bed, brushing her hair back from her forehead. She looked up at me sleepily. "Mommy, why is Daddy on people's phones?" I kissed her cheek gently. Because sometimes when people lie, the truth finds them anyway. I turned off her lamp and stood in the hallway for a long time, the quiet pressing in around me. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I realized I didn't even have to swing the axe. All I had done was hand people the rope, and Mark was hanging himself with it. And as his world continued to crumble, I felt the ground beneath my own feet grow steady again, knowing the reckoning had only just begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a mixture of history and weariness that clung to the air. I sat at the long oak table beside Rachel, the folder of evidence stacked neatly in front of us. Mark entered from the other side, shoulders hunched, tie hanging loose. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though the weeks of exposure had already hollowed him out. When the judge called the session to order, Rachel rose with quiet confidence. She began with the finances, sliding receipts and bank statements across the table one by one. "These charges," she said evenly, "are not marital spending. They are theft. He drained funds from my client's inheritance money left to her by her late mother and funneled them into another relationship." Mark's lawyer objected, but the judge silenced him with a glance. Mark tried to speak, insisting the money had been in joint accounts, but Rachel cut him off, gently pointing out dates, amounts, and signatures. The ring receipt with the store's official stamp landed on the judge's desk like a final stone in a collapsing wall. He leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. then ruled that the accounts be frozen and divided. I was awarded the house, the savings, and control of Sophie's financial future. Mark was left with little more than debt. The next battle was custody. Mark's attorney painted him as a devoted father, speaking of bedtime stories and weekend ice cream runs. Rachel didn't even raise her voice when she responded. This man brought his mistress around their 6-year-old child and instructed her to keep it a secret from her mother. That is not parenting. That is manipulation. I had provided Sophie's words in writing, simple, childlike, but clear. Daddy told me not to tell Mommy about the lady with earring. The judge read the statement twice before setting it down. The decision came quickly. Primary custody awarded to me, supervised visits only for Mark. His face twisted as if the words had struck him, but he didn't argue. He simply stared at the table, jaw clenched. Family testimony followed. Leonard took the stand, first his voice gravelly with age and disappointment. I trusted Mark with the family name and with business contacts tied to our reputation. He disgraced all of us. He turned toward his son, eyes cold. You are not welcome in my house. Susan sat quietly behind him, tears slipping down her cheeks, unable to lift her gaze to her eldest child. Mark's younger brother Daniel spoke next. His voice shook with controlled anger. Do you know how many calls I've gotten clients asking if I'm the cheating Whitman? You dragged our name through the mud. Don't contact me again. The words cut sharper than any lawyer's argument. By the time he stepped down, Mark looked like a man cornered from all sides. Brianna was nowhere to be found. Rumors whispered that she had packed her things the moment his cards stopped working, retreating quietly back to her parents' home in the suburbs. Friends said she pawned the ring for a fraction of its value. She had vanished from social media, leaving behind nothing but the echo of judgment. The hearings dragged on for weeks, each session whittling away at what little ground Mark tried to hold. Rachel pressed her case with quiet precision, and his attorney seemed more defeated each time he shuffled papers. By the final session, the judge summarized his ruling swiftly. The house custody and the majority of assets were awarded to me. Mark walked away with his car, a few personal belongings, and a stack of mounting legal bills. When court adjourned, he tried to approach me in the hallway. His face was pale, his tie askew, his eyes frantic. Claire, please. We can work something out. Don't leave me with nothing. I looked at him steadily, my voice calm. You did this to yourself. You had everything, and you threw it away. Now you'll live with the consequences. He opened his mouth to argue, but security stepped between us. He didn't push past them. He simply slumped against the wall, shoulders sagging, a hollow shadow of the man who once walked with arrogant confidence. As I stepped outside, the autumn air was crisp against my face. The leaves had begun to turn, and for the first time in 11 years, I felt truly free. The courthouse doors closed behind me, sealing Mark's downfall inside. Word of the verdict spread quickly. His suspension at work became termination. His LinkedIn profile, once filled with praise, now sat empty. Colleagues withdrew endorsements, and no one returned his calls. Leonard severed his son's ties to the family business, cutting off both financial support and social standing. At gatherings, his name was no longer spoken. For me, life began to rebuild in quiet ways. Sophie and I settled back into the Lincoln Park house, the weight of his absence transforming the rooms. I repainted walls, replaced old curtains, and cleared the clutter he had left behind. The house breathed easier, lighter. One Saturday morning, Sophie and I walked to the farmer's market, buying fresh flowers and a small pastry to share. As she ran ahead, her laughter carried across the square, unburdened by the tension that had once filled our home. I stood there, watching her twirl with a sunflower in her hand, realizing just how much peace had returned. Meanwhile, Mark drifted further into obscurity. An old acquaintance told Paige they had seen him working behind the counter of a rental car agency near the airport. Another whispered he was drinking alone at a bar on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't seek confirmation. I didn't need to. The image fit too easily. In the end, justice hadn't come through dramatic revenge or shouting matches. It had arrived through patience, preparation, and truth laid bare. His collapse was public, undeniable, and irreversible. And yet, as I tucked Sophie into bed one quiet night, I knew my story wasn't only about his downfall. It was about what came after the rebuilding, the reclaiming of dignity, and the reminder that betrayal may shake the foundation, but it doesn't have to break the person standing on it. The reckoning was over. What remained was mine to shape. 6 months after the final ruling, my life barely resembled the one I had been living. The house in Lincoln Park was truly mine now, each room stripped of the heaviness that once lingered. I repainted the walls, replaced the curtains, and filled the corners with light and laughter. Sophie's drawings decorated the fridge, her crayons scattered across the coffee table, not hidden away in fear of being scolded. The quiet was no longer tense. It was peaceful. Work had taken on a different shape, too. What had once been a part-time routine became a full-time role where I was trusted and respected. My boss told me more than once that he had never seen me so sure of myself, and clients began asking for me by name. For the first time in years, I wasn't simply balancing or surviving, I was thriving. Sophie was blooming too. At 6, she carried a resilience that humbled me. The supervised visits with Mark had grown sparse. More often than not, he canceled at the last minute, too embarrassed or too broke to show up. At first, I worried it would hurt her, but children have a way of sensing truth before adults do. She stopped asking when he might come. Instead, she began drawing pictures of just us, mother and daughter, holding hands beneath a bright sun. When I found one taped to her bedroom wall, I smiled because it told me everything she needed had been here all along. As for Mark, he had become more ghost than man. Word drifted back to me in fragments from Paige, from acquaintances, from the occasional whisper at the grocery store. He had lost his job permanently after the scandal refused to fade. His father cut him out of family ventures, and his brother blocked his number. Even his mother, who once smoothed over every mistake, no longer defended him when his name came up. Someone said they had seen him working behind the counter at a car rental agency near O'Hare, another that he was drinking alone at a bar on a Tuesday afternoon. I never went looking. I didn't need to. The image was clear enough. There was a time when I thought hate would anchor me forever, but it surprised me how quickly that faded. Hate requires attention, and I no longer had any to give. What filled me instead was something colder, quieter, nothing at all. He had become irrelevant, a closed chapter. On Saturdays, Sophie and I started a new tradition. We walked to the farmer's market, bought flowers and a pastry, then stopped by the little park nearby. She would run across the grass, her laughter bright against the morning air, while I sat on a bench with the flowers resting in my lap. In those moments, I realized how light my steps had become. Freedom, I learned, isn't just about losing the chains, it's about rediscovering who you are without them. Sometimes, in the stillness of evening, I thought of my mother. I wondered what she would say if she could see us now. I liked to imagine her hand on my shoulder, her voice steady, reminding me that strength isn't found in holding a broken life together. It's in knowing when to let go. Her inheritance, the one Mark tried to squander, hadn't been wasted after all. It had bought me more than a house. It had bought me perspective and the fire to fight for myself and for Sophie. The day I walked into Riviera Jewelers should have broken me. Instead, it became the day I found myself again. Betrayal has a way of stripping you bare, showing you not only who others are, but who you are when everything falls away. And in that rawness, you either shatter or you rise. I chose to rise. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, because you never know who might find strength in your words. And if you'd like to hear more true family stories, you're welcome to stay connected here.